Hi everyone. Okay, so this is the, make sure that's recording. Okay, this is the video lecture for the PowerPoint Sociobiology. A couple things before we get started. So you might have noticed in the syllabus that this is split up over 2 days. So the PowerPoint itself, as you probably noticed as well, is not very long. However, what ends up happening usually in class is that this subject, probably more so than a lot of the other topics, as you'll soon see, usually there's a lot of discussion, people have a lot of questions. I of course end up going on some tangents of some sort. There's just a lot of information and a lot of lively discussion typically. So typically I spread it out over 2 days. Now, because you guys aren't actually here and we can have that back and forth interaction, it might be shorter. However, I knowing myself, I'm anticipating that I'm probably going to talk a lot about some of this. So while the PowerPoint itself is not very long, I might end up doing 2 PowerPoints for this, just for the ease of recording and the ease of watching and all that. And so I might split that up, just like I did with the genus Homo. I split that up. So same thing here. Anyway, so very likely what I'll end up doing is, if I get to 25-ish minutes and we really are only maybe at the halfway point, I'll probably just stop it. So anyway, I guess we'll kind of figure that out as we go. So I guess to get started, also real quick, so I just want to say, hopefully you guys are watching the video announcements. I know the majority of you are. I see how many views the videos are getting, and it seems as if, based on my discussions and emails back and forth with some of you, it's not a problem. However, I do know that there are a few of you who are still not watching them. So please take the opportunity to do that, either the written ones, but the majority of the information is on those video announcements. And if you are one of those students who, I'm assuming most of you are, who are watching those, when I post them, who are watching these lectures, there's a lot of information. Some of the times the information is a little repetitive. I'm hoping that for those handful of students who aren't watching all of them, they're at least watching some of them and getting some of that information. So that's just, I don't know, to remind you guys, it's important to kind of keep up to date with some of this information. 99% of the questions you guys have for me, that information is going to be in the syllabus, but those announcements will help clarify some of the questions that you might have. Okay, anyway. So back to the actual PowerPoint. So sociobiology. So slide 1 is the title slide. Slide 2. So you'll see a picture of what looks like a book cover. That's because it is. So this field of study, sociobiology, has its origins in this book that was written in the 1970s. Now, these ideas weren't particularly new necessarily. Other researchers had ideas like this. But E.O. Wilson was the first to, per the name of his the book, The New Synthesis, was to kind of synthesize, was to gather all these data, compile them into a book that people could read, could see, okay, look, we're getting this research evidence data from these different areas, and we can put it all together. I think we have something new here. And that was this idea called sociobiology. Now, at the time, it was very, very controversial. Now, in 2020, we don't really think of it as being a controversial idea, because now we've had decades for us to kind of understand it, get behind it, expand on it, create whole other subfields of looking at this idea. So you're probably thinking, okay, it's not controversial now, but it was then. Like, what's the big deal? What's going on? So these are the details. Go to slide number 3, and you'll see what this book talked about. So this book talks about a lot of research from everything from insects to primates, all these different, like all of animal life, and talks about these particular things: reproductive strategies, social behavior, aggression, affiliative behavior, kin selection. Some of these terms you're probably familiar with. We've talked about them in class before. Some of them might be new, and we'll go into those. But the book, essentially, to oversimplify it, really looked at how do we understand behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Now, before, there had been no issue with looking at the morphological changes, the physiological changes, anatomical changes that had occurred, whether it was humans or any other animal, like that had occurred for millions and millions of years through the evolutionary process. Like biologists, anthropologists, we all understood that. Still fine-tuning our understanding of it, but it was like nothing controversial about that. But then E.O. Wilson and some other researchers were like, well, what about behavior? Like, yeah, some people have kind of looked into it, but like we really need a better understanding of this. Like, and it was very controversial at the time. I think, I think like this is accurate. A lot of people thought, well, okay, sure, evolution can explain like why I'm bipedal, or why my brain is bigger, or why I have 4 limbs, like whatever. Like, it can explain anything physical about me. But they had a big problem with taking that idea and saying, oh yes, and also evolution can explain the choices I make, the decisions I make, the behaviors that I have, the actions that I do, and so like, I mean, now it's not that controversial, and in fact, like there are entire fields and subfields dedicated to this idea. So like one that usually my students are familiar with is something called evolutionary psychology, which you can like take courses on this in like the anthropology department, psychology department. In fact, like if you take an intro to like Psych 101, you'll usually get a whole section on looking at modern human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So like this is not controversial at all for us now. Sorry guys, like I am like allergies, I'm like so stuffed up, so it's hard for me to breathe and talk at the same time. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so this book looked at like different behaviors from an evolutionary perspective. Now it started to get controversial because there was a lot of this back and forth. A lot of researchers thought, okay, like I said before, like they thought, okay, sure, evolution can explain what my physical body is, but it can't explain like my personality, like why I am the way I am. Like that's me, that's intrinsically me. That's not something that's been affected by other factors. Now, of course, like we've talked about some of these ideas in class before. We talked about reproductive strategies, like the first one on the list, like why you might choose the mate, why you might choose a certain mate, why you might be attracted to an individual. So we talked about, let me see if I remember, MHC compatibility, body hair and testosterone, and waist to hip ratio. Those are the ones that are just coming to mind. I think we talked about more, but those are the ones that are coming to my mind right now. So like we've already talked about that as a class, that like clearly we understand like you're not making those decisions in a vacuum. Like there's something that has affected and is still affecting the decisions you make, the choices you make, whether it's like something directly related, like we think like biologically, like, oh sure, like your mates or something, but like you start kind of extrapolating that to other parts of your life, like it becomes a little more difficult, and it became very controversial because people started thinking like, okay, like you're saying evolution can describe like why I do the things I do, and people just had a big problem with this. So I'm going to pause that part. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But so back to this PowerPoint. So the book just talked about these different things, social behaviors, which we've talked about in class, reproductive strategies, aggression, affiliative behavior. So if you're not familiar with this, so affiliative behavior are like social behaviors that we often do, like that you would consider like that kind of keep like cohesion in the group. So like a classic like intro to anthropology examples, like grooming, like you see other animals grooming each other, like primates grooming each other. This is an affiliative behavior. And then kin selection. I think we have talked about kin selection in this class briefly. So we're going to talk about that more here. So if you're just looking at this list, you would say, okay, like I'm not really seeing anything super controversial. Yeah, I might get what people would have a problem, maybe a little bit, like with behavior and evolution, but I think a lot of that is because we're living in a time now where there's been so much research since this book, Sociobiology, came out, that now it's just like, of course not, because now we have like all this evidence and data to back it up. But at the time, it was very controversial. Like people really didn't like this idea of thinking that there was a like a natural explanation, a biological explanation for why they are the way they are. People want to hold on to like our individualness, And we're going to talk about that again after a couple slides. Okay, so going back to this idea of kin selection. So slide number 4. So when, I think, like I said, I think we talked about this as a class, but just in case we didn't, I want to make sure we're clear on this. And I'm throwing in a bunch of new terms on this slide too. So this is a little more text heavy than usual. So kin selection. So we talked about in class before fitness. We talked about individual fitness. So individual fitness being the number of offspring you have. So you are more or less fit than someone else. Like I have 0 offspring. If someone has like 2 offspring, they are more evolutionary fit than I am. Their fitness is higher. So if you recall, we talked about that that phrase, survival of the fittest, and how it's often used incorrectly. It does not mean survival of those who are faster or stronger. In reality, we know that, of course, it can be very adaptive to be small and slow, depending on your environment. But survival of the fittest means survival of the people with the most offspring, because when you're thinking about that evolutionarily, like from generation to generation, because the definition of evolution, hopefully you guys remember this, a change in allele frequency in a population over time. If we're thinking about it in those terms, we're looking at like, have you contributed your genetic information into the next generation? Typically we think of that as like, do you have offspring? Do you have individual fitness? Is your individual fitness higher or lower than someone else's? So individual fitness is based, like this is a simplified version, but it's based on the number of offspring you have. So we talked about individual fitness, but we also, I think, touched on inclusive fitness. And I go into this a little bit more on this PowerPoint, because I'm pretty sure I talked to you guys about the work I did for my master's work, about looking at females who had an inclusive fitness strategy. So there are ways that you can still contribute to the next generation genetically without having offspring. Now you might be thinking like, how? But then ask yourself this question: who, if you don't have children yourself, who in the next generation do you still share a reasonable amount of genetic information with? And of course, probably most of you are probably thinking, oh, your nieces and nephews. This is accurate. If you have siblings, their offspring, who aren't going to have as much genetic information shared with you as like your own offspring might, but it's more than what you have, because you have 0 if you have no children. You can still invest in your nieces and nephews, like resources or time or money or whatever resource you want to invest, because you're still investing essentially in your genetic success, your inclusive fitness in some way. So individual fitness, inclusive fitness. Now, kin selection is just kind of elaborating more on this idea of inclusive fitness, that there are behaviors associated with inclusive fitness. And typically when we're talking about kin selection, we're usually talking about those behaviors that are likely to be detrimental to us. So there's I'm so thirsty. There is I'm blanking on the animal. There's probably a handful of examples, but imagine there's a group of animals, maybe let's say dogs, doesn't matter. And they're in a pack, there's a bunch of them, and maybe there's a predator coming nearby, like a big snake. And one of the dogs might bark to warn the others. Like we see this with animals, like from humans to any other type of like animal you could think of. We see this type of behavior often, especially those who are highly social, and they live in big communities. But this type of behavior, if you're like calling out to warn others about a predator nearby, you're actually, what you're doing is you're drawing direct attention to yourself. Like that predator is like, oh, that one's yelling out, I see it right away. You're drawing attention to yourself. So this can be like this behavior is detrimental to you, but it's for the benefit of those who are closely related to you, probably those in your immediate family. So we see this type of behavior all the time in the animal world. Now, a while back, researchers thought, okay, what are we seeing here? This seems interesting. They seem to be, this is detrimental to themselves. Why would they do this? And then researchers starting to understand, oh, has to do with inclusive fitness. This is something called kin selection. They might be performing some kind of behavior in some way that might be detrimental to them, either like in the moment or long term, but it's going to be for the benefit of those who they share genetic information with, especially those in the next generation, offspring and nieces and nephews. So we see this time and time again. In fact, there's been so much research that we know that individuals, whether it's human or another animal, are more likely to do these behaviors that may or may not, that may be detrimental to themselves in the moment, if it's going to benefit someone who they are very closely related to. And that likelihood of them doing that behavior will decrease the more that person is distantly related to them. So you're like, think of it this way, you're more likely to sacrifice, something for like your own children than you would like a third cousin. And you're probably more likely to sacrifice something for a third cousin than you are a complete stranger. Like this is just how, like, time and time again, the research backs this up. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, sure, that's probably true most of the time, but people do like random acts of kindness for strangers all the time. Like, of course. Remember, we talked about this. Anything in nature, there is always going to be a statistical outlier. That doesn't mean that the rule is not accurate. That's just how nature is. So this rule holds true for almost all of the time. That when people do make sacrifices, whether it's if we're talking about humans, whether it's like a monetary sacrifice or a resource sacrifice, it's more likely to happen for those who they are closely related to. So a really good example would be a parent, like say you're low on food. A parent is going to sacrifice, maybe they're not going to eat that day so their kids can eat. Now we would think of that, if we're not thinking about it in evolutionary terms, we think like that person is a good person. Of course, any parent would make that sacrifice for the love of their children. Of course, that's true. But when you start examining that from an evolutionary perspective, we understand this makes complete sense. Because if you as an individual, like if you die, but you've already passed your genetic information into the next generation, that's your only concern, is making sure that those individuals are surviving. If that makes sense to you guys. Because like this whole idea of looking at things in this way, this evolutionary process, like fitness, whether they are going to, whether you're passing genetic information into the next generation or whether you're doing it more so than someone else. This is the whole point of we were talking about earlier in the semester with natural selection and this competition, and it's not always about, and this is going to be an important point I'm going to bring up again in a minute, but it's not always about I'm blanking the term, you don't have to be faster than the bear. That it's not always about this optimal state. It's about what's just working a little bit better. So there's always behind the scenes also this like competition between these individuals. Anyway, so getting back to what I was saying though about kin selection. So sometimes there will be behaviors that people will do, individuals will do, whether it's humans or cats or dogs or whatever, that seem to be in the moment maybe a detriment to themselves, but often with easily examining the scenario, you see that it's actually for the benefit of those who are closely related to them. So far you might be thinking, okay, yeah, that took a little bit of explaining, but it doesn't seem like super controversial, like at all, not really. So, but this is all kind of happening at the same time. All these ideas, like these types of, this field of research is kind of coming about. But people had a problem with this because what they started, I don't want to get on too many tangents right away. And in fact, what are we at on time? 18 minutes. Okay. I don't want to go on too many tangents before I miss what I actually wrote in my PowerPoints for you guys. Okay. Let me see what I have on the next slide real quick. Okay, let's still stay on slide 4. Okay. No, let's move on. Okay. I think I have it. Okay. So slide number 5. So a little bit more on kin selection. So now I'm throwing a new term in called group selection. This is a lot of information for you guys. It's hard too because you guys are just watching this video. Like, it's so hard when we're not in class and I can't, like, I don't know, get your guys' reaction. Like, are you getting this? Because like we could spend like weeks talking about just this PowerPoint. Like, I've taken a whole class where we spent like half the semester talking about sociobiology and kin selection and inclusive fitness. Like this is a lot of heavier stuff. Like this is probably some of the more like theoretically, conceptually complex stuff we're going to get in this class, which is why it's like at the end. Hopefully what we've been building on throughout the semester hopefully will help you guys understand these concepts. So I know it's kind of a lot. The convenience of the video is that you guys can just watch it again. But okay, so we're on slide 5. So another term, group selection. So often, when people are thinking about these ideas of individual fitness, inclusive fitness, kin selection, they're like, okay, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's something called group selection. Now I'm going to tell you right now, before I even tell you really explain what group selection is, group selection does not really hold up. I would say not all, but the majority of probably anthropologists would say group selection doesn't work. It doesn't really, conceptually doesn't really make sense. There's a lot of bias built into it. But there are people who are proponents of group selection. Unfortunately, often it's used when they can't explain something like, oh, well, then it must be group selection. Yeah, well, that's not a legitimate explanation for something. Anyway, okay, so you're probably thinking, well, what is group selection? What does this have to do with what we were just talking about kin selection, inclusive fitness, all that? Okay, so if we're thinking about this idea of like an animal, calling out to its family, hey, there's a predator, run away. If we're understanding that from an evolutionary perspective, we're like, okay, that makes sense. They're gonna sacrifice themselves. Maybe they'll die, maybe they won't, hopefully. But it's for the benefit of those who are closely related to them genetically. This makes sense evolutionarily. However, some would say, well, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe it's something called group selection. And what they're actually doing is, it has nothing to do with who they're closely related to. They're just calling out to everyone in the group. And their behavior is some selfless, magical behavior that they are just doing for the benefit of the group. Now you might be thinking, okay, like I know my professor's kind of making fun of it right now in the video, but maybe it's true. And you might even pull personal examples from your life. Like, sure, like I might help like my family more, but I, or maybe people I know, we do things for like, strangers all the time. Maybe I volunteer. Like, of course we know that people do that. Of course we understand that we're not just only ever going to do things for the benefit of those we are related to. There are evolutionary explanations for that as well. But going back to this idea of group selection though, it's often the evolutionary, the inclusive fitness or the kin selection explanation is often disregarded. In the examples I have seen, personally, I would say that the majority of times when people are trying to have an argument in support of group selection, typically it's this very romanticized view, overly romanticized view of humans specifically. They want to make humans special in this argument. They want to make humans separate from other animals. They want to make it seem as if we are not subject to the same evolutionary processes as other animals, that we do things for the benefit of others. We are selfless. But any of the actual research, the data backs up that that's not the case. That people, individuals, whether it's humans or rats or cats or whatever, will often do altruistic behavior. Will often do like selfless things, but often it is for the benefit of someone, and typically most of the time that someone is someone we are very closely related to. So evolutionarily, this whole process makes complete sense. But you will still find people who are like, no, it's for the benefit of the group, and it's like that just doesn't really hold up. Also I'll tell you, like if you like go into Wikipedia and like group selection, you'll be like in a maze of like YouTube and Wikipedia and like Google Scholar for like all day. It's still a highly debated topic. The other point I want to make about group selection is that people will often try to argue it's like comparable to like what's the word I'm thinking of, like a type of like a natural selection process, instead of we're seeing, like we tend to think of like natural selection happening at the level of the individual. You could even make the argument that it's happening at the level of the gene. But for those who are proponents of group selection, they'll say it's happening at the level of the group. So when you make that argument and you're trying to make it analogous, like group selection, individual selection, and trying to make these analogies, like the whole argument just falls apart. And I would say, at least in my experience, when I've seen like, papers written on this, 95% of the time, what the arguments end up boiling down to is the only thing that these people are really describing are is individual selection that's just happening, that happens to be occurring in a species that lives in a group. Like any social species, like all primate species, most mammal species, we live in groups. We're going to have interesting, complex social behavior because we live in a group that sometimes will include individuals who are not necessarily super closely related to. That does not somehow mean suddenly that everything you do is for the benefit of the group. In fact, that's not it. I know this is a lot of information. I know this is a lot of complex stuff. You're probably thinking, oh my God, there's so many terms. I'm not expecting you guys to understand all of this completely. I'm really hoping to just kind of spark some ideas in your mind about some of these things. So, okay. So moving on to slide 6. Hamilton's rule. Okay, so this is just a really simple, a visual kind of equation to think about inclusive or kin selection. What is the behavior that the individual is doing? The altruist. What are they doing? What's the cost to them? Is it like a resource they're giving up? Is it making themselves more noticeable to a predator? Like, what is the behavior? What is the cost? And then what is the benefit to the person receiving, that warning or that resource? So typically what you'll find is that and then of course the relatedness between the two. You're more likely as an individual to depending on the benefit of the cost and the relatedness of the individual, you're more likely to do something that's more costly to you if the individual is more closely related to you. You're more likely to sacrifice a lot of resources for your children, like I said before, than you would maybe a third or fourth cousin. You might still do it, but you're definitely going to be more willing to sacrifice for your kids. There's no doubt about that. And I think we want to think, well, of course, that's what we do. We're parents. We love our children. And like I said before, that's totally true. I'm not taking anything away from that. But if we want to kind of look at that from a slightly different perspective, from a biological evolutionary perspective, we can absolutely explain it by this. So just keep that in mind. And this kind of gets back to this idea of why this idea is controversial. Before we even finish up this PowerPoint and get into some other more details, this is why it was controversial, because people at the time were wait a minute, yeah, evolution can explain my body, but it can't explain everything about who I am. It can't explain my personality. It can't explain why I love people in my family. It can't explain why I why am I blanking? It can't explain any of the behaviors that are innate to who we are as individuals. There's something about, people want to believe that there's something about who we are as individuals that it just cannot be explained by any kind of natural or evolutionary process. And this whole debate ended up kind of coming down to this notion, this kind of main argument of, do we have free will? Does free will exist? If we can explain not only morphology, but behavior from an evolutionary perspective, we can say every decision you make in your life, whether it's who you mate with, how many children you have, how you're having those children, what kind of food you buy, what sacrifices you're making in terms of resources, everything. If evolution can explain all that, am I making any choices? Do I actually have free will? And people got really upset about this. They were they couldn't understand, they wanted to believe I have free will. I have free will and that's my bias. Of course, they probably didn't recognize that. But that's a bias. You're coming in with an assumption already. And of course, you'd be well, it's a legitimate assumption. We want to believe that we have free will. But if you really start examining things from an evolutionary perspective, you cannot deny that it takes, that behaviors, your behaviors can either mostly or all can be explained by the evolutionary process. And so this is a hard thing, I think, for people to accept. You're saying that I might not actually be deciding anything, or maybe I'm deciding only a little bit. That's a hard thing to really think about. And we don't want to think about because that's kind of that's a deep thought, even if we're talking about biology, that's a deep thought to have. I'm not really choosing anything. And you can imagine the different side debates you get in philosophy and biology and genetics, how this all it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And to me, it's like so interesting, and I love talking about this with people and colleagues. I've gotten into heated arguments with people because this is one of those topics in our field that people feel really strongly about. Like, either you're like, we don't have free will, or you're like, hello, we have free will. Like, it's hard for people to accept. And when E.O. Wilson first wrote this, he was like, I wasn't trying to have a debate about like free will. I was just trying to explain evolutionary or behavior from an evolutionary perspective. It can be extrapolated, I guess, yeah, to the fact that we probably don't have free will. And now, since then, of course, there's been research to back this up. But at the time, people were like, did not want to accept that. And they had a big problem with it. And often a lot of this stemmed from this idea that, like this idea, like, okay, sure, like maybe you can explain like behavior in dogs. Like dogs don't have free will, but humans have to have free will. And like I said, I've said this so many times to you guys, humans are interesting and special in our own way, just like every other species is interesting and special in their own way. We are not unique in that. We are not somehow separate from nature. Nature is not a ladder. It's a branch. It's a tree with branches. We just happen to be one of those branches. We have our own bias. Like, we are humans, so of course we think humans are more special, or like we're separate, we're better. If we were dogs, we would think dogs were the best. If we were squirrels, we would think squirrels were the best. Like, that's our own bias. Now you could say, okay, sure, professor, like that's accurate, but like you can't deny that like humans have some qualities that are like just clearly better or separate from other animals in nature. And I would say, like, okay, sure, like I said, we are unique and interesting in our own way. But if you have the example of like, because I get this example a lot in class, students will say, well, like, what about cell phones or computers? Like, other animals can't do that. Yeah, but like, you didn't do that. Like, that's, technology is often based on like a few individuals out of all like the billions of humans. It's not all of us as individuals have that knowledge or that ability. That's certain individuals kind of carrying us as a species. You don't have that ability. Like, if I asked you to take your phone apart and like, or put a phone together, you'd be like, I don't know what to do. Like, we don't have that ability. But also, like, even when you think about the interesting things about humans, I would say like there are plenty of other animals who have way more interesting things about them. Like, I think I gave this example to you guys before about we were talking about echolocation, or like the ability to change color. Like, that's super complex, and humans don't have that ability at all. We also, remember, we watched those videos with the chimpanzees. Like they are better at us with all that memory stuff. Like, we are just like, we think we're better. When you really start looking at the actual research and data, we're like, are we really special? Like, we happen to be special in certain ways because we're bipedal and we freed up our hands and we have big brains. Like, and we can do some cool stuff sometimes. But like, it's not as if it's the end all be all of like everything in the world. Like, remember this, that evolution is not, there's no goal. There's no goal towards becoming more human-like. There's no goal towards, I mean, maybe you can make the argument that there's a goal towards complexity, but even then, like, what is complex? Like, how do you define complexity? It's a whole, like I said, we could spend a whole semester talking about just this one thing. And so you can imagine people got really, like, this back and forth, and the fourth article review that you're doing, hopefully you notice, is actually two really short articles together, and they're like, one is a response to the other. It is about this exact topic of sociobiology. People got really staunch in their opinions on either side, and it was just this back and forth in academia for a long time, and even now it still is. Okay, let's see, slide 7. Okay, slide 7. Okay, so this is kind of saying what I was saying, and I think this might be the last slide for this. Yeah, because I think, what are we at, like 25 minutes or something? I think I'm going to stop it here, and then we'll do another video. But let me finish up this part. Okay, so I kind of already said this, that this is why it's controversial. People did not want to believe that they didn't have free will. Suddenly, there was data showing evolution. We could explain behavior, whether it was, you know, the groceries you bought, the person you married, like everything could be understood from an evolutionary perspective. And suddenly people were like, no, they couldn't believe it, they couldn't accept it, and they really wanted to believe that they were special and that they had, that there was something innate about them that could not be explained by natural processes. And people had a hard time with this. And then, of course, not to like rag on them, but then of course you've got people who came at it from a very scientific perspective. Like, maybe they had data showing that there was free will, and that's completely legitimate in terms of the scientific process. We need those contrasting ideas to move us forward. But like I said, per this slide, a lot of it kind of stemmed from this idea that humans are special in some way. We are separate in some way, and that's just, you can't start out with that assumption, with that bias. Okay, I'm glad I didn't forget this part. This is an important part. Along with these debates, sometimes people would say, okay, if evolution can explain my behavior, natural selection is part of the natural selective process, why don't we always do things that make sense? Why doesn't every behavior we have, why isn't it adaptive? Why are we constantly making the wrong choice? Mating with the wrong person, marrying the wrong person, buying unhealthy food. Like, why are we constantly making bad decisions if it's part of an evolutionary process, part of a natural process? And this is so important because this idea can easily be, you can easily say, like, that argument does not make sense. Because remember, we talked about this before, this idea of you don't have to be faster than the bear. Evolution is not about getting to an optimal state where everything works really well. It's always about getting to what just happens to work a little better than the other thing. That's what's going to work. That's what's going to, continue. So whether that's something morphological like bipedalism happened to, because of the interesting dynamic of the species and the environment, bipedalism just happened to work a little better for whatever reason, ecologically or energy efficiency, a little bit better than quadrupedalism, so our lineage switched to bipedalism. It doesn't mean that bipedalism is without problems. Of course, we know even 6 million years ago, or 6 million years of being bipedal, people still have problems with their back, with their feet, with their legs, because it's not about being this perfect optimal state. It's just about being having a state, whether it's physical or behavioral, that's slightly better. So you're never going to have this perfect morphology or this perfect behavior. That's not how it's going to work. So that argument doesn't really hold up either. Okay, so I'm gonna stop it there, and then I'll continue the next video. We'll finish up the second half. Okay.